Okay, so have you ever had one of those moments, those times when, like, you just absolutely know you can't mess something up?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Like, the stakes are just so high. If one tiny thing goes wrong, it's like the whole thing's gonna just completely fall apart.
Yeah.
So, like, developing a new medicine, for instance,
Right.
people's lives depend on these
Oh,
things.
absolutely. And that's where risk management and this idea of quality assurance,
Yeah.
that's where it becomes so critical, especially, when we're talking about something like clinical trials.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
So, if the thought of navigating these complexities of clinical trials and how to make sure they're run to the highest standards, if that all seems a bit daunting,
Yeah, can be.
this deep dive is here to help.
Think of it like we're giving you the cheat sheet, the Spark Notes version of like
Hmm.
how to understand data reliability and, most importantly, the safety of those participating in the trials.
Yeah, and we did a lot of research for this deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking the Code of Federal
Look,
Regulations, specifically parts 110, 111, 211, and 312.
got it.
But we didn't stop there. We also looked at ICH, the International Council for Harmonization Guidelines.
Right. Global standards.
Exactly, global standards.
Yeah.
And of course, you can't do a deep dive without checking out the expertise on YouTube.
Right.
We looked at folks like EAS Consulting,
Hmm.
Risk Revolution,
Yeah, those guys are great.
and we even looked at some insights from Devon Edwards.
Oh, yeah. Love his stuff.
And of course, we read through some very dense books on pharmaceutical manufacturing and regulations.
You gotta love a good textbook.
They're a real page turner.
Yeah. Always a good time.
So for this deep dive, we really wanted to hone in on risk management and quality assurance, specifically within clinical trials.
Right. So we'll be breaking down how compliance is maintained
Yeah.
and what happens when things, inevitably kind of go off script.
Because it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's going to happen.
So that's where deviation management comes in.
Right.
And of course, we'll be looking at KPI and corrective and preventive actions, how the industry really learns and grows from these experiences.
Right. Making those mistakes, but learning from them.
Okay, so first things first, let's talk about GMPs.
Good manufacturing practices.
Good manufacturing practices, the cornerstone of it all.
For sure.
So how do they work to really ensure everything's done right in a clinical trial and that the product they're testing is, actually good?
Well, at its heart, GMP, it lays out these ground rules for how to make high-quality medicine consistently and to make sure everything's done by the book, all the regulations.
So it's like the foundation.
Yeah, the bedrock of pharmaceutical quality.
And there are these 5 key elements,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Like Devon Edwards really hit on people, premises, processes, products, and procedures.
And these aren't just like nice suggestions,
Right.
right?
No, they're like the law and the ethics of the industry.
It's the real deal.
It's the real deal.
And I always find it so interesting to think about, like, how did we get here? It wasn't always so structured.
No.
So what really drove the development of GMP?
Well, Edwards pointed to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 as like a really important early step.
Okay.
Because back then people were worried about products that were unsafe or mislabeled.
Right.
And so this act was kind of a response to that.
Right.
But it was the sulfanilamide tragedy in 1937 that really underlined the need for stronger regulations.
Right.
This was a heartbreaking situation where a new liquid medicine used a toxic solvent and there weren't any rules requiring safety testing before it went to market. So sadly, it caused a lot of deaths. And that event really pushed for more comprehensive regulations that we know now as GMPs.
It's a really tragic example, but it highlights why these practices are in place.
Absolutely. It showed that trusting companies to do the right thing wasn't enough. We needed strong, legally mandated practices to keep people safe.
So GMPs are not just best practices.
Yeah.
They're the law.
The law in following them is not optional.
Right.
It's a legal requirement for anyone involved in making pharmaceuticals, including, the stuff used in clinical trials.
Right. So we understand why GMPs are so important.
Mm-hmm.
But now let's talk about the physical spaces and equipment used in developing and manufacturing these products.
The premises.
The premise, exactly.
Yeah.
So how does that environment actually play into quality and safety?
It's a huge factor.
Mm.
The way these facilities are designed and maintained is super important for preventing contamination, and that can directly affect the quality of the product and obviously the safety of the people in the trial.
Right.
Like think about something as basic as a floor drain.
Okay.
They need to have these things called air brakes, which stop sewage from backing up and potentially contaminating the manufacturing area.
That makes sense.
And Jacobs and Signore, they stress that having good waste removal systems easily accessible places to wash up, and really clear written cleaning procedures are all essential for maintaining a controlled environment.
It's all about minimizing those risks.
Exactly. You don't want something in the environment messing up the medicine being developed.
Right. And it's not just the building itself, right?
No.
It's also the equipment used in the process.
Oh, yeah, the equipment is critical.
Mhm.
CFR 21, Part 110, actually requires proper ventilation to control airborne contaminants and odors, and you got to have solid pest control measures to prevent any contamination from pests. So,
Yeah.
Everything's about creating a space where the product is protected.
And speaking of protection, CFR 21 Part 211 is all about the equipment,
Right.
mandating that it needs to be designed, sized, and positioned so that it can be thoroughly cleaned and maintained, to prevent any adulteration of the drug.
If equipment's hard to clean, it can become a breeding ground for contaminants, even if you have, like, the cleanest facility in the world.
It's true. I've heard the term equipment qualification thrown around quite a bit.
DQ, IQ, OQ, PQ.
Yeah, that whole alphabet soup, what is that all about?
So you can think of it as like building this documented confidence in the equipment at each stage of its life.
Oh.
So as ES Consulting Group explained design qualification, or DQ, it's basically confirming that the equipment is designed to meet the specific requirements and regulations.
So it's designed right from the start.
Exactly. And then installation qualification, IQ, verifies that the equipment is actually installed correctly.
Following the manufacturer's specifications.
Exactly, by the book. And they have operational qualification, OQ.
Okay.
This demonstrates that the equipment runs as intended across all the operating ranges, the ones it's expected to encounter.
So making sure it actually does what it's supposed to do.
Right. And then finally, you have performance qualification, PQ, which proves that the equipment consistently produces the desired quality product under, normal production conditions.
It's like a step-by-step process to make sure the equipment is suitable and it's working reliably.
And it's not just a one-time thing.
Right.
You have to do requalification periodically, especially after big changes or repairs, or even if the equipment is moved.
Even moving it.
Yeah, even moving something like an HPLC system can mess with its performance,
Yeah.
As ES Consulting Group pointed out. And all of these qualification steps all have to be documented carefully in standard operating procedures, or SOPs,
Right.
and in these detailed qualification protocols.
It seems like quite a process.
Oh, it is.
What about simpler equipment, though?
Yeah.
Like a pH meter in a lab, does that have to go through that whole rigmarole?
Actually, no EAS Consulting Group clarified that while big complex systems go through the full DQ, IQ, OQ, PQ,
Right.
simpler instruments just need to be calibrated before they're used for the first time and then at regular intervals.
Makes sense.
So for those big stationary systems, calibration is often part of the PQ phase. But for those portable instruments like the pH meters or balances, calibration happens more frequently.
So it's really about making sure the instrument is giving you reliable readings.
Exactly. And the key is really, no matter what, whether it's qualification or calibration, everything needs to be written down.
In those logbooks.
Exactly. You've got to have detailed logbooks documenting all those activities.
So we've talked about the physical environment, the tools.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's get into the actual processes of developing and manufacturing these drugs used in trials. So how do we ensure quality and compliance during this phase?
That's where standard operating procedures, or SOPs, come in.
Use SOPs?
They are absolutely critical. EAS Consulting Group really stressed that SOPs provide a detailed guide for every test and every single manufacturing process, and the golden rule here.
If it's not written down, it didn't happen.
Exactly. If it's not documented in an SOP and followed, it's like it never happened from a regulatory standpoint.
You've got to have those standardized procedures to make sure everything is consistent and reproducible.
Exactly. And CFR 21 Part 111, it specifically mandates written procedures for so many activities.
Like what kind of things?
Oh, cleaning and sanitizing equipment and the facilities themselves, preventing contamination, ensuring that materials are handled in a sanitary way, and even preventing mix-ups when you're packaging and labeling.
It's all late.
Yes. And these aren't just suggestions. They're legal requirements.
Yeah.
Designed to protect the quality of the product and the patient's safety.
And it's not enough to just write these procedures down, right?
No, you got to prove that they actually work consistently.
Right.
And that's where process validation enters the picture.
Okay. I remember us talking about that in a previous deep dive. So remind me, what is it again?
So process validation is about establishing documented proof that a specific process carried out under very specific conditions consistently creates a product that meets those predetermined quality specs.
So it's showing that your process reliably churns out a good product.
Exactly. And it's not just about having these written procedures for production and process control. You also have to keep really detailed documentation.
Write down everything.
Yes, as it happens, contemporaneous documentation, they call it.
That's so interesting.
It is.
We talked about cleaning earlier with the facilities, but it sounds like cleaning protocols are a whole other beast on their own.
Oh, yeah, they're essential. They're
Yeah.
non-negotiable. As we discussed in Season 8, and as CFR 21 Parts 110 and 111 highlight, robust cleaning protocols are key for preventing both contamination and mix-ups between products.
Makes sense.
This includes having very specific cleaning schedules and validated cleaning procedures, making sure those cleaning methods actually work. And it even goes into the design of the facility itself, like using airlocks to minimize contamination.
So many layers of prevention.
Exactly.
But even with all that in such a complex field like drug development, things can still slip through the cracks.
Right.
And that's where risk management comes in, I think.
Exactly. Quality risk management, or QRM, it's a systematic way to identify, assess, control, and review potential risks to the quality of a drug throughout its whole life cycle.
So it's not just putting out fires as they pop up. It's about anticipating problems and putting controls in place beforehand.
Exactly. It's a proactive approach instead of a reactive one.
So what are like the key questions you ask when you're doing this risk assessment?
Well, Rodriguez-Perez really laid it out for us.
Right.
Okay. The first one is, what could go wrong?
Okay.
Second, how likely is that to actually happen? And then if it did happen, how bad would the consequences be?
Makes sense.
And, by systematically going through these questions, you can then figure out what risks to focus on and how to mitigate them.
So it's all about prioritizing your efforts.
Exactly.
Are there any specific methods or tools that are used for risk assessment in this field?
Oh, yeah. Definitely one that's often used is failure mode and effects analysis, or FMEA, as Rodriguez-Perez mentioned.
Okay.
And it's a very structured way to identify potential failure points within a process.
Yeah.
To then figure out how likely those failures are, how severe they would be, and then what you can do to reduce or eliminate those risks.
So it's like preemptive troubleshooting.
Exactly.
And risk management. It's not just like a separate thing, right?
No,
It's
no.
woven into all the other aspects of GMP.
Absolutely. As we discussed in Season 2, deep dive risk management principles are a part of equipment qualification, change control procedures, and all the other elements of GMP. It's like the guiding principle for making informed decisions at every single stage.
And when we talk about clinical trials specifically,
Right.
and the responsibilities of investigators, how does this concept of risk management play in?
Well, the FDA, they emphasize the importance of what they call risk proportionality in clinical trial design and oversight.
Oh.
They talk about this in their CITC Day 3 training. And it's basically about making sure your monitoring efforts and resources are focused on the data points and processes that are most critical for the study's integrity and the participants' safety.
So you're not just looking at every single piece of data
No, it's about strategically allocating your resources.
based on the level of risk.
Exactly.
And it seems like the whole approach to risk management is evolving.
Oh, for sure.
I've been hearing more about comprehensive contamination control strategies.
Right. And Risk Revolution, in their analysis of the new Annex 1 guidelines, they highlighted this growing expectation for manufacturers to have a formal, documented, and implemented contamination control strategy.
So it's not just about hoping contamination doesn't happen.
No, it's about being proactive and having a plan.
So even with all these precautions in place, there's still going to be times when things deviate from the validated processes.
Right. Deviations happen.
Then what?
Deviations from validated processes are a no-go, and they have to be thoroughly addressed, as both Jacobs and Signore and our Season 8 deep dive pointed out. And this is where, deviation management and CAA, corrective and preventive actions, yes, they really come into play.
You've mentioned KPay a few times, so
Yeah.
if something goes wrong or an issue's flagged, KPay is that structured way to deal with it.
Exactly. KPay is a systematic process.
Yeah.
It investigates and addresses any deviations, nonconformances, audit findings, and most importantly, it's about preventing them from happening again.
It's not just about fixing the immediate problem. It's about understanding the why.
Exactly, the root cause, and then taking steps to prevent it from happening again. Our Season 6 deep dive and Rodriguez-Perez both outlined this process really well.
So what are those key steps in the CPA process?
Well, the first and most important step is to figure out the root cause. Do a thorough root cause analysis.
Okay.
You can't really fix a problem if you're just treating the symptoms you have. to get to the heart of the issue once you've identified the root cause. Then you can implement corrective actions to address the immediate problem and bring everything back into compliance.
So get things back on track.
Exactly. But the real power of CUP-PA is in those preventive actions, the steps you take to stop similar problems from happening again. And often this involves addressing weaknesses in the system itself.
This is a more long-term solution. It's not just a Band-Aid.
No, and taking those corrective actions quickly, that's crucial. And then you have to monitor to make sure those actions are actually working, as we discussed in Season 6.
Right.
And then Rodriguez-Perez pointed out that if there are any out-of-specification or OOS test results, you have to broaden the investigation to include other batches or products that could be affected, not just the one with the OOS result. And then you have process trending, which is analyzing data over time that helps you catch potential quality issues before they become big problems.
So you're constantly looking for those early warning signs.
Exactly. And all of this generates so much data and documentation.
Right.
So how do you ensure that all that information is accurate and reliable?
That's where quality control and good documentation practices come in.
Absolutely. And strong lab controls are key. As EAS Consulting Group explained, this means having qualified and regularly calibrated equipment, following clearly defined test methods, which are detailed in those SOPs, and documenting everything meticulously and accurately.
So those SOPs for test methods, what kind of info is usually in those?
A test method SOP is a very detailed guide on how to perform a specific lab test. An EAS Consulting Group noted that it needs to include every single step of the procedure, whether the method was developed in-house or adopted from an official source like the USP.
Okay.
It'll usually have sections on safety precautions, for handling chemicals, a full list of the reagents and materials needed, clear instructions on how to prep standards and media, and examples of the data you should expect, like spectra or chromatograms, and it'll even have example calculations and guidelines for reporting results.
That's very thorough.
Oh, it is. And beyond those specific test methods, there are other controls in place in the lab, too.
Oh, like what?
Well, labs use a variety of systems to ensure data integrity and proper sample handling.
Okay.
Things like using standardized forms for submitting samples, a strict chain of custody to track those samples from the time they're collected to when they're analyzed, standardized forms for preparing media and chemical reagents, and then you have these data review checklists that make sure every part of the analysis is done and documented correctly.
So many checks and balances.
Right. It's all about making sure the data is reliable.
And then, of course, there's the documentation.
Okay.
I've heard about the LCOA plus principles. What are those all about?
LCOA plus, it represents the fundamental principles of good documentation practices, or GDP.
GDP?
Yes, and Silent did a great job explaining this.
Okay.
So it's an acronym. It stands for attributable. So it needs to be clear who did what.
Okay.
Legible, meaning all entries have to be readable. Contemporaneous, the record has to be made at the time the activity happened. Original, meaning it's the first record of the data.
Yeah.
Accurate, meaning the information is correct and truthful.
Gotcha.
And then the Li Plus adds some other important things. Complete, so all the relevant data is included. Consistent, meaning the data makes sense and is in the right order. Enduring, meaning the records are kept for the required time. And available, meaning you can easily find those records.
So it's like the who, what, when, where, why, and how of data.
Exactly. It's all about ensuring that the data is trustworthy. And for electronic systems, it's also essential to have audit trails that track any changes to the data.
So it's all about transparency.
Exactly.
And if you make a mistake in your documentation, you can't just erase it, right?
Nope. You have to draw a single line through the mistake initial and date the correction and write a brief explanation for the change. This makes sure there's a clear record of what happened and who made the correction.
It's about accountability.
Exactly. And this applies to both paper and electronic records. And for really important documents, you often need a second person to review it.
A peer review.
Yes, to double check that everything is accurate and complete.
So how long do you have to keep all these records?
Well, CFR 21 Part 211 says that records for drug product batches have to be kept for at least 1 year after the batch's expiration date. And for some over-the-counter drugs that don't have an expiration date, it's usually 3 years after the batch was distributed.
And with all these rules and regulations, there must be some serious oversight to make sure everyone's following them.
Oh, yeah. The FDA plays a huge role in enforcing these regulations.
Yeah.
And they do that through inspections, which are often conducted under their Bioresearch Monitoring Program, as Cara Alaro from the FDA explained during CITC Day 3. And the main goals of these inspections are to protect people participating in research, to verify the quality of the research data, and to ensure everyone is following the rules.
And these inspections aren't just for manufacturing facilities, right?
No, they also inspect the clinical trial sites where the research is being conducted.
So they're really checking every step of the process.
Exactly. The FDA does good clinical practice, or GCP, inspections at those trial sites. And the Office of Scientific Investigations, or OSI, within the FDA, they're really involved in the GCP review process, especially for new drug applications and biologics license applications.
So what is GCP exactly?
So GCP, it's a set of ethical and scientific quality standards that have to be followed when designing, conducting, recording, and reporting clinical trials that involve people.
So it's all about making sure the data is reliable and that people in the trials are protected.
Exactly. And so during an FDA inspection, investigators will go through things like the study protocols, the informed consent forms. We'll check the qualifications of the investigators and staff. They'll look at the data and other records and really assess how the clinical trial site is being run.
It sounds very thorough.
Oh, it is. They're checking for compliance with FDA regulations and GCP guidelines.
And if they find something,
Right. If the investigators see any potential violations or areas of concern, they issue a Form 483, which lists those observations.
Right.
And then the firm that was inspected has to respond in writing, usually within 15 business days,
right.
outlining exactly what they're going to do to fix those issues. And that's where KP comes in again.
So what happens if a company or research site just doesn't comply?
Well, our sources didn't get into specifics about enforcement actions, but we know that the consequences can be pretty serious.
Right.
They range from warning letters for minor violations to more significant actions like putting a hold on studies or even withdrawing drug approvals if serious problems are found and not fixed.
It's really about making sure people are protected.
Exactly.
And being transparent with the regulatory agencies is also key, right?
Absolutely. Open communication is essential for maintaining compliance, as we discussed in Season 7.
So to sum it all up, making sure new medicines are safe and effective is a huge undertaking
It really is.
with so much oversight and attention to detail.
Absolutely. And it all relies on this interconnected web of good manufacturing practices, proactive risk management, strong quality assurance systems, and sticking to the regulations.
And it's not just about reacting to problems.
Really,
It's about
so-
building quality into every single step of the way.
Exactly. And being super meticulous with documentation and really fostering that culture of quality and safety throughout the entire process.
It's about protecting patients and ensuring that the research is sound.
Exactly.
Right.
You know, by taking these proactive measures and really sweating the details.
Right.
From how facilities are designed to how accurately information is documented, the industry is constantly working to minimize risks, ensure the data from clinical trials is reliable, and most importantly, protect the health and well-being of the people in these trials.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. I think it really makes you appreciate all the work that goes into bringing new medicines to the people who need them.
It's a huge team effort.
And it kind of makes you wonder,
Yeah.
how could we apply these same principles of risk management and quality assurance to other areas of our lives?
Right.
You know, outside of pharmaceuticals.
That's a great question to think about.
Where do you need to be extra careful and prevent mistakes?
Exactly.
Could a more systematic approach help you there?
You know, to where you're identifying potential risks, putting preventative measures in place, and being really rigorous about quality.
Right.
Could that lead to more dependable and trustworthy outcomes in other parts of your life or your work?
It's a thought-provoking idea.
It is. It shows that this isn't just a concept for pharmaceuticals. It's a way of thinking that can be applied to so many complex situations.
Food for thought.
Food for thought.